Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our session on research infrastructure and how it's supporting sustainable agriculture, nutrition and development. I'll introduce myself first of all. So I'm Richard Dickman. I'm the CEO of the Australian Plant Phenomics Network and I'm the moderator for today's session. So we're going to talk, as I said, about research infrastructure and sustainable agriculture. I think it's, first of all, I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and I'd like to thank the organisers for selecting this wonderful hotel, and I'm really enjoying the food. The food is excellent. Of course, as we consume food, we're always linking ourselves, we're invisibly linked to the world's agriculture and food systems. Probably what's less thought about and less known, of course, is that we are also linked to the world's water system, to the world's air system when we breathe, because agriculture has tremendous impacts across all of these areas. So we're going to consider how research infrastructure can impact those areas, and we're going to move in our discussion today through the urgent need for continued investment in agriculture via RIs. We're going to move on to the hard infrastructure and then the if you like, the soft infrastructure, the human infrastructure, and then also link into the north-south question. It's a very important topic in this space. So going ahead, first of all, I'll acknowledge the acknowledgement and welcome to country given during the earlier part of today. And I'll just go on now to just mention a few topics. Really to set this discussion up. So we're talking about sustainability, and at its simplest form, we're always looking at the three pillars of sustainability. And from an economic aspect, it's kind of deceptive. Agriculture represents 4.2% of the world's GDP, which is deceptively small. But at other levels, it has a massive impact. It employs 2.83 billion people are directly or indirectly involved in agriculture, which is something like 35% of the world's population. And going on from that, agriculture produces 22% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. They are very hard to abate. Greenhouse gas emissions, if we want to eat, it's going to be very difficult to abate them. And it consumes some 70% of the world's water. And of course, we all know that food production needs to rise by some 50% before 2050. And at societal levels, of course, it has tremendous impact as well. I mean, the fact that it employs those people, a very large amount of them are in less developed nations, so it's critically important that it maintains its presence. And then we see that investment is very often dominated by the main crops in the world. Probably 75% of investment is directed towards the 5 major crops, yet there are hundreds of orphan crops which are very important for nutrition and culturally as well. And we see this strange situation, this contradiction at the moment. Right now, hunger is actually rising again in the world. At the same time, obesity is also rising in other countries. So agricultural research driven by RI can provide answers, but we face some fundamental challenges. And I often show this slide to just broadly represent them. On the left-hand side, they're graphs from Australia which show that the climate is changing at an incredibly rapid rate here. Yet on the right-hand side, we find our researchers are hamstrung by very manual, very difficult and analogue systems that really haven't changed over the last 100 years. And research infrastructure can actually address some of those issues and actually increase the rate at which we can address the challenge that we face. So we've got 4 great speakers here today, and I'm going to hand first to Professor Paul Gauthier. He's a professorial research fellow at the Centre of Horticulture Science at the University of Queensland. He's going to open up the topic with some figures on the way in which climate and other factors are affecting the world's food systems. Thank you, Paul.
All right. For a while back, that should be easy. All right. The colour didn't show up the same way. Anyway, All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for staying. We could probably look at the amount of people in the room, and that will tell you how much people care about agriculture. Unfortunately, we all have food on our plates today, and someone has to do it. So I'm Professor Paul Gaultier. I've joined UQ about 3 years ago. I'm one of the world leader in vertical farming, and I, of course, expanded my scope into protected cropping when I came to Australia. And the main reason why I care about all of that is because one of the biggest challenges for the 21st century is how are we going to feed a growing population without impacting our environment. And the projection of the world population is about 9.6 billion by 2050. And we are basically adding 1 billion people on this planet every 10 years, which is a significant amount of people. And at the same time, we got some challenge that have been put on the table. And one of the challenge is we need to increase our food production by 77%. And at the same time, unfortunately, climate change is impacting us. And we know that if we have an increase of temperature of 3 degrees across the world, we'll have a decrease of 50% of our production in some areas, Australia included. And so that's a major challenge. And as you could see, most of the country in red there, where a lot of population is going to be, Africa mostly, but also South America and Southeast Asia. So that means that this region won't necessarily have the food necessary to do that. And these values that I just showed was 2005. We are almost 20 years later, and we are very far from the targets that we have. So we know we are going to a food crisis, but for some reasons, we didn't really invest into this kind of research for quite a long time. For Australia, this kind of impact is actually higher because Australia is warming faster than the rest of the world, and that's basically represented by some of the recent 10, 15 years ago, but some of the recent events in Australia. Every time we have an extreme event, especially in Queensland, 50% of our farmers actually run out of business. And we all remember, if we are Australian, what happened to the flooding in 2022, and that cost Australia a lot, $250,000 for just New South Wales, $250,000 for Queensland. I can go on and get to $1 billion very quickly. So every year it's really costing a lot of money just by the impact of climate change. At the same time, we are in a global world, and the world is also continue growing faster than Australia and the rest of the world. And the rest of the world is going to increase the import and increase the demand for food, mostly in Asia and also Africa, which is a major problem that we have to tackle. China is the biggest importer by 2050. What that means is, and you have probably seen some of the infrastructures that China have been investing in. Most recently, the mega port in South America, in Peru, in Shanghai. This major port is going to suck up all the food out of South America toward China, which is a problem because most countries that import food won't be able to have access to them. So that's some of the things that we need to deal with and need to think about when we think about the future. In Australia, we tend to say we don't have a food security issue. We usually say we're just going to produce more food. Well, that's true. Then why in 2023, most, I will say 29% of the Australians actually suffer of food insecurity in 2023. When it's a country that have plenty of food, it's kind of a strange aspect. So what we need to do is to accelerate our development of protected cropping. We need to accelerate the way we train the next generation and thinking about the next generation of farmers. What does it mean for them? In a climate changed world, we need to think about what kind of infrastructure, what kind of research we want to be able to do, to be able to train the next generation. We have trained usually traditional farming, outdoor. We know what the consequences are with outdoor, especially when the different picture I show you. And so it's important to really look at what can we do to train the next generation who have different expectations than the previous generation, and also that with the shrinking of the amount of farmers farming our land, we need to see how we could, I would say, tackle some of the needs of the new generation. And one of the things that we have done at the University of Queensland is partnering with people from the APAC, mainly Korea, Japan, and other countries, to look at what we can do to bring this technology back to Australia, to really start different facilities and develop the next generation. There's a massive opportunity for Queensland, of course, but not just Queensland, New South Wales and Australia in general. And I really want to say there that it's an opportunity for collaborating across the world. There is a lot of technology that some countries haven't really shared with the rest of the world, and we can all benefit of this amazing infrastructure to train the next generation of farmers. Okay. And so we do have some initiative here partnering with the government as well as our Institute for Queensland Alliance for Agriculture and Food Innovation, QAFI, where I belong. And we also have defined short-term, middle-term, and long-term strategy. I think that's one of the important parts, especially when we think about science and research. We usually don't necessarily think about the very long-term part. We are training the next generation, the people that are going to feed our kids or eventually our grandkids in the future. And if we don't invest into it now, it's not when the crisis hits us in the face that we'll be able to do it. So that's really all what I wanted to say about all this context. But mostly, the two conclusions there is like developing infrastructure is a way to secure our future. Sorry for the pun. And food security is also national security, and especially when the world is really changing and we have seen the thing outside, thinking of food security as national security is an important aspect that other countries like the US have put on their table. So with that, thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Let's. We've got plenty of seats here, so let's use them. Look, I'd now like to invite Mr. Stijn Dont. He's the head of the VIB Agro Incubator and also the leader of Emphasis, the European phenotyping network. So he's going to run us through a few of the developments from the European perspective, particularly in relation to how they view sustainability in the food system.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. And indeed, I'm representing Emphasis as a research infrastructure on plant phenotyping. As you probably all know, indeed, climate change is not only happening in Australia, it's also true in Europe. And agriculture is actually facing a number of challenges also there. So we do see a lot of more extreme weather events. It can be drought. For instance, last year was very dry, but also with very extreme temperatures compared to the normal averages. This year, on the other hand, has been a very wet year with a number of major flooding events throughout Europe. So this is changing also for the plants. We also do see more an expanded range of pests and diseases where the plants need to cope with. And in the end, this leads to a reduction of the yield, but also to a reduction of the harvest quality that we get from the fields. And ultimately, this has an impact on food security, of course. If that is not sufficient, we also have a number of challenging targets to meet. So in scope of the European Green Deal and part of the Farm to Fork strategy, we have the aim to reduce the input in terms of fertilizers, but also agrochemicals in the agricultural sphere by 50% by 2030. So that means actually that there's a strong need for innovation in the agricultural system, and that we also need new genetic resources to be able to cope with this. So therefore, from the aspect of the research infrastructure, we're developing Emphasis, and there we really have the aim to set up a multi-scale phenotyping capability where we want to look into the different varieties of multiple crops and how they deal with different climate environments. So therefore, we're currently developing a research infrastructure. We have about 10 different countries around the table at this point in time. We're trying to organize that and coordinate that from within Europe and within VIB as a research institute. So a couple of years ago, we did a mapping exercise to look at which facilities do we have available within Europe, and we came up with a list of about 200 different installations spread across Europe. In order to create a bit of structure, we have been dividing them in 4 different groups. We call them controlled conditions, intensive field, lean field, and then of course all of these physical installations need to deal with data as well. So we also have a group around data and computational services. To give you a bit more insight what that actually means in terms of infrastructures, we here have a couple of examples related to controlled condition facilities. They are setups in greenhouses, in growth rooms, often involve quite a high level of automation as well, really looking at the development and the response of the plants to specific environments in a relatively high throughput manner. When we talk about the intensive fields, so these are really dedicated field setups, can be systems that are, well, difficult to move from one field to another, so not very mobile. We see examples of gantry systems, of a rainout shelter, a dedicated tractor platform, for instance, doing very specific measurements in the field that are not that easy to replicate everywhere. On the other hand, what we call lean fields is more a network of fields, and the idea is that this allows us to set up trials, agricultural trials, in different climatic regions, so that the results of that can be compared, where we use UAVs, drones, sometimes also satellite data, to bring all that data together. So over time, indeed, emphasis has been trying to provide access to those facilities, and also to develop a number of services through different projects supported by the European Union. On the one hand, there's the development of the infrastructure by itself, but there are a number of projects, for instance, AgroServe, with quite a number of partners, but also Microbes for Climate that are really supporting transnational access. We have AI for Life, focusing on new AI tools related to image analysis and agriculture. And yesterday, in a side session, I talked about FENET, developing new tools and methods specifically for agroecology. Of course, we don't do all of that work within the research infrastructure. It requires a lot of communities. Many different countries are involved, and all of those countries are actually setting up what we call their national nodes. And they deal with their local national communities, and we try to bring all of that together on a European level, with emphasis really with the intention to address the challenges that agriculture is currently facing and will be facing in the coming decades. So thanks for that. If you have more questions, feel free to reach out through one of our channels, but you can also reach out to me or Ines, who is also here representing our research infrastructure. Thank you.
Thanks, Dane. So that was very much focused, I would say, on the hard infrastructure, the physical infrastructure that's been established in Europe, and we have some of that here in Australia. But you know, infrastructure also is a tremendous driver, and it provides a tremendous opportunity for partnerships at the international level. And I'd like to invite Professor Wei Guo from the Institute of Sustainable Agro-Ecosystems and Services at Tokyo. And he's going to give us some examples of how he's built very important collaborations based on research infrastructure.
Thank you very much. I will introduce something about the software and about the data set. So it's about the weight. So we had this project called Global Weight Dataset Project since 2019. You might probably ask me, why weight in Japan? So the quick answer is weight actually does matters also in Japan, because we import too much weight broadly, but now we wanted to have a little bit of self-sufficiency in Japan as well. So in order to run this one, so basically we started to have this project since 2019 among Japan and France. So the initiative was that we have exchange student from France come to Japan, and we started to discuss. At the moment, we have one subject called, we wanted to measure the head number per unit area, which means the yield of the weight you are looking at the field. So that will be this part. and when we started with this one, and recently we started with another one. The second one, I will introduce the detail later. Yes. So with the first one, we released the first dataset from 2020. We got around 10 countries contributed to this one. So the collaboration is very simple. Basically, we bring the dataset. Initially, we had the dataset from Japan, Australia, and France. And then we bring the dataset to different institutions to ask, do you want to join us? Why? Because if you look at this picture, you might probably understand we are in the AI era, right? Everyone wants to detect the head of the wheat, but the wheat appears in different shapes, and it grows in different environment. So everything is different. In order to build a good, let's say, artificial intelligence model that can detect the head and counting the number of the weight, you want to have a large amount of the data set, but how large will be large? So it's very difficult to answer, but one quick answer will be if we could have a diverse enough data set that can solve most of the problem. So that brings us the motivation to bring all the communities to join us to contribute the data set, and then we put the data set together. And you already saw from the previous presenters, you probably can understand people are using different sensing techniques. Some pictures might coming from the cell phone, some pictures might come from the drones, some pictures might coming from the gantries. So must be a standard of the data sets that you can deal with. So we made the protocol and we bring the data set together like this. The good thing for this initial project was that we released the first version is not perfect. We got a lot of cramps. People are complaining about the quality of the data set. And then we fixed the problem and we quickly released the second version of this data set. And you can say we are not just bring the impact into the agriculture area, but it's also actually bring impact to the computer science as well. So you see this wild data set from the Stanford, it's more about the general data set for the big data analysis. So Global Wheat was invited as a part of this project initiative as well, so that we got more concentrations from different area. And since we say about the impact of this, once you bring the data set together with different institutions and you bring them together, we wanted to say, hey, if we can have more people look at the data set and tell us what we have to do, because we are all from agricultural area, right? We're probably not good at artificial intelligence. So we started to run this global competition. I'm happy to announce you that this Global Wheat is probably the first competition in cargo that are only focused on agriculture. And we got a lot of data scientists come to join this competition, and they understand, oh, there is a lot of problems for agriculture, and they have to solve these problems. And on the other hand, we also learned a lot from them. So for us, it's more like you never had a chance to learn computer science that quickly if you do not release your data sets to the public. So that's a good sign, and that's a good model, and we get model for free. Almost for free, which is really worth to do it. And after that, at the end, I would like to announce you the new data set. So not just about the detection. I think we are more now concentrated about the segmentation. So we do have more things to look at, not just the head. We are going to look at the diseases. We are going to look at the leaves. We are going to look at the growth status. And we are bringing more countries to join the project, and the data set is more diverse. And if you have interest to join this project, please contact me or the new leader of the Global Wheat, Andres from ATH Zurich. in the central of the Europe. And we're happy to close here. And please feel free to visit our website and see if there are something that can help you. Thank you.
So thanks very much. I mean, I think that gives an example of the power of these types of infrastructure to bring certainly institutions together, but even people from outside of our normal agricultural community. Tremendous opportunity there. So this happens at big institutional level, but it happens at personal levels as well. And we need to be thinking all the time about how we're going to develop our next generation of scientists. So Professor Daniel Wei is running our Australian National University node of APPN, but she has a personal story to tell about how she's been able to develop her career through these infrastructure.
Thank you. So indeed, Richard asked me if I could talk a little bit from the level of a personal researcher about the role of infrastructure and research infrastructure in developing your work on climate change and its impacts on both agriculture for myself, where I'm now working, but also originally I came more from a forestry and ecosystems perspective. So if you see trees, it's not because I think they're wheat, it's simply because that's what I was working on earlier. So for myself, I started my PhD at the University of Toronto. I'm Canadian, and it was really my first venue into working with intensive research infrastructure, partly because my research really focuses on how plants respond to climate change. And I would argue that the best way to do that is actually to grow them under future climate change scenarios. But that involves infrastructure that can control CO2 concentrations, future temperatures, as well as water availability. So in Toronto, I had access to these fabulous facilities that can control CO2 and temperature in both these small growth chambers, but also the larger glass houses. And I'd like to point out that the work you could do in those is quite small. You're working with seedlings, you're working with pots, and indeed, some of the research was small enough that I had to climb inside the growth chambers, occasionally scaring my colleagues when I would open the door when they were watering their plants next door. During my postdoc, I then wanted to be able to go to a larger level, and I moved to the United States, to Duke University. And although part of that reason for moving was because of the quality of the researchers that I had access to there, part of it was also due to the fabulous research infrastructure that was available. And so I'd like to highlight the phytotron there at the top right. Again, large-scale glass houses, many growth chambers, many different capabilities for manipulating climate to understand how plants will fare in the future. And then also work that I did in Texas here with a very different type of experiment, where this is out in the field. This is the LICOG experiment, which stands for lysimeter CO2 gradient. What you're seeing here is a polytunnel that actually has different soil mesocosms that are over 1 meter tall that have been sunk back into the earth that are sitting on balances to look at water balance, as well as a CO2 gradient being imposed on top of that in the airspace. So you started to be able to move out into the field and look at how plants are responding under much more natural conditions than you can do in a glasshouse or growth chamber. I also had the ability to work at one of the free air CO2 exchange experiments. So these are known as FACE sites. This is the one at Duke working on pine plantations, where we went through $1 million of CO2 a year just to maintain this experiment, where you have individual plots, as you can see here, where the trees are growing in natural soils, natural environment, herbivory that's happening naturally. But what you're doing is you're exposing some of them to high CO2 being piped in through these pipe systems, and other ones are under current conditions, looking at how that whole ecosystem will respond to climate change. I then started a lab back in Canada. I was attracted back partly because it was Canada, but also largely because the research infrastructure was available there for me to do my work. I simply can't go to universities that don't have that capacity. And so while I was there, I became the director of the Biotron Center for Climate Change Research. And this is a picture of it here at the top. You can see this building. We had many walk-in and reach-in growth chambers that you can see here at the top right, large-scale glass houses that have CO2, temperature, and humidity control, and also, in fact, some unique infrastructure, including 2-story tall chambers where you could work on trees and work both below ground and above ground within the same system. So this was really a large attractant to being able to do work on how plants are responding to climate change, to be able to do these large-scale experiments. and also collaborating with colleagues in the United States on a US Department of Energy funded experiment where they have 10 open-top chambers outside in a forest. These are quite large, as you can probably see. These are 40 to 50-year-old trees growing inside these chambers, where there's warming and there's high CO2 being applied to these ecosystems, again, out in a rather natural system where you can really look at how these systems and these plants are going to respond to future climate change and get the data we need to be able to understand how those systems will change. In the last 2.5 years, I've moved here to Australia. So a large part of that was, again, due to access to really good researchers, but also fabulous infrastructure. And so even though Richard is our CEO, I'm not just saying this because I love the Australian Plant Phenomics Network, but I am our director at the ANU node, the Australian National University. And to have the capacity to not only have large-scale research infrastructure for growing plants under future climate change, where I'm currently working on adapting wheat to future climates and identifying lines that are climate-proof, it's also having the tools to do high-throughput phenotyping to actually get away from that challenge that Richard discussed earlier about people having to work in this very analog way, where you can scan hundreds or thousands of plants in a day and start getting to these results much faster. And so I want to say we have fabulous facilities for doing that, as well as fabulous staff who support those facilities, and that's also a really critical part of making this work. So really, I just guess I want to point out 3 things from sort of an international researcher perspective who's moved around quite a bit and depends on this sort of infrastructure. The one is that if we're looking at climate change responses in plants, whether that's agriculture or forestry, there isn't a one-size-fits-all, right? So you need to be able to do work at different scales and in different places to find the answers that you need. I'd also point out that building the infrastructure is a fabulous first step, but it's not sufficient if it's not continued to be supported. And so infrastructure that's built and left and not maintained with financial support can only work for so long, and that constantly needs to be upgraded, which I've been very impressed actually in Australia's investments in that through ICRI in maintaining funding to upgrade and bring those facilities to the cutting edge. And lastly, I would point out that all of this research really depends on having talented staff that can support them, because again, infrastructure by itself won't work unless you have the people to make it work, and you have the people to actually keep the instruments working, keep everything maintained, and keep all of the experiments going. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Danny. That's fantastic. And thanks to all the speakers. They were great kind of insights into the full range of impacts of research infrastructure. Look, you know, this food system, as indicated, it's very significant in terms of you know, its impact globally and also the linkages through to developing countries. And we're lucky enough today to have Professor Sushil Kumar, who's the Director of Research at the University of South Pacific in Fiji. And I've invited him here to give just a few comments about his perceptions of what was presented here. Obviously, things are very different in South Pacific countries, but we'd like to have your reflections, please, Professor Kumar.
Good afternoon, and Nisham Bula in our native Fijian language. My background basically is not agriculture, but I have been administering a scheme called Australian Centre for International Agriculture Research, and then the University of the South Pacific Agriculture Scholarship from last 12 years. And the scholarship deals with the several projects which are active from the Australia in the South Pacific region, and there are the scholarships at master's and PhD level. I would give a little bit of perspective here from South Pacific point of view, but before that, I would appreciate and congratulate the colleagues who have given the different backgrounds and the different aspects of the research and infrastructure systems in the agriculture in their respective countries and their respective organizations. So I think those comments you have already seen. The South Pacific region, actually, it is a region of very small island countries with the population of about 800,000 to about thousands of the people, and they are small islands. They have their specific challenges, for example, like the limited resources, the financial difficulties, and then the vulnerability to the climate, and then the natural hazards particularly. But if you look at their economy, it primarily depends upon the tourism and the agriculture. And as the moderator has said that in terms of the world economy, it is about 4.27, which agriculture contributes. But if you look at these small island countries, if I name some of them, they have, for example, like the biggest country, the Solomon Island, in which the agriculture contributes 34.3% of their GDP. And then similarly, if I look at the Kiribati, 26.3, the Vanuatu, 27, Fiji, 10.6, and then the minimum one is the 5.1, Cook Islands. That means these countries are very strongly dependent on the agriculture. We have spoken about water system, water security, food security, and so on. The integral part of all this system is the soil. And if you look at the soil of these island countries, there are two types of soils. Number one is the highly volcanic island soil, and the another one is the low-end, high atoll soils. And there are the advantages of these soils and then limitations also. And then these soils are sustainable they're vulnerable as well to the climate change associated impacts. For example, like there's a sea level rise, and then there are low-lying islands. And if the rainfall, because of the increase in the temperature, increases by about certain percent, for example, like 8.36%, it might affect their economies by 20.2%. And then there are El Nino conditions and so on. And then one of the conditions which severely impacts is the tropical cyclones. And you can see that a strong tropical cyclone like Winston, if you have heard, it could damage about 50% of the economy of the Fiji for a year. There are the impacts of the climate change over those soils, like the acidification of volcanic soils because of the low-lying islands. There's a loss of fertility, there are changes in the soil moisture, the less water available, and then changes in the height of the water table, and then the other challenges. So those are the challenges of those South Pacific countries. In terms of the policies and regulations, we have got the policy called the 2050 Pacific Blue Continent Policy. And this is the policy in which the strategic research themes have been decided. The one of the theme is the ocean agriculture and then the climate impacts. The policy is well documented. It's available on the internet, but we do not have any policy which is on the research infrastructures. Means how are we going to develop that? And then the regulations as well. Since within the region, there are no funding agencies as well. For example, like if you look at, there was a presentation in USA, there are about 20, 30 funding agencies, the several in Australia and New Zealand. Therefore, our research infrastructures primarily depend upon what we secure from the externally funded projects. And this is where we need very strong collaborations and then very strong partnerships. And this is where, actually, I would urge that this is the region which needs more and more stronger collaborations and then the partnerships. And we look forward for the new collaborations and the partnerships. Thank you.
So thanks. That brings to a close the formal presentation. So look, we've got a little bit of time for some questions. So I mean, unless anyone's got a particular question at the moment, I'll kick off with a question. So I mean, the first question we've got here is, and I'll throw it to the panel in general. So yeah, given the increasing impacts of climate change, how can research infrastructures prioritise efforts to develop resilient crops and optimise food production systems suited to changing conditions. So I don't know who would like to kick off with that one. Maybe Wei, or okay, go ahead. Yeah. No. Yep.
You've done it before.
Yeah.
This is a bit like being in an undergraduate course where nobody wants to put their hand up.
Yeah.
So I would say that certainly from my own perspective, one of the strategies really is to actually, again, look at growing these plants under the future climate conditions that we expect, try to identify which ones perform better, or at least maintain yield and maintain nutritional quality under future conditions. So I would say that's one important aspect of it. But that sort of work, again, is usually done in these very controlled environment conditions, which doesn't necessarily get at all of the other questions about soils that were raised or the extreme events that Paul showed, where I think having a diversity of solutions really is the way that you're going to move forward.
Yeah, I think if I want to add to that, I think the problem with climate change is we don't really know where we are heading to. And we can't really predict what the future is. I mean, we can't even predict the weather for next week, to be honest, right? I mean, temperature is the easiest thing to predict in a temperature weather, and we still can't do it very well. So we can't imagine 50 years or 20 years from now. So our approach has been always to look into infrastructures that can remove the problem of environment, which is control-environment agriculture. And having the infrastructure to be able to do this kind of research indoor removes the challenge of trying to catch up with adapting the plant for the future climate. And I think one of the biggest aspects of infrastructure today that we need to think about is what kind of infrastructure, yes, for research, but applied directly for horticulture or for agriculture. What do we need to build now or research now for it to have an impact when we need it in the future, 2050, 2060. I used to say that I actually don't live in 2024, but live in 2050, because that's really where we should be. And especially as academic, I believe we have a responsibility of doing long-term research and not short-term. And when we think about breeding for the future, I always say, well, it's kind of a waste of time in a certain way, because we are trying to breed outdoor for an environment of today, when the work that Danny have been doing for a long time is trying to breed for the future, or trying to predict, like if you start a breeding program today saying, well, we had drought for the past few years, we'll breed for this environment, we'll predict maybe it's 2 or 3 degrees, but if it's 4 degrees, then you are already obsolete by the time you deliver your cultivar. So it's an important part of we have 2 options. We need to continue with the right infrastructure to breed for outdoor, and we need also to look into what can we put indoor to allow more outdoor expansion.
So one of the things about controlled environment is it's deceptively very sustainable, because you recycle water and you minimise nutrient use. Stain, maybe you can make a comment. I mean, sustainability and sustainable farm systems are a hot topic in Europe. And how do you balance the food production requirements, with the need to, reduce inputs into agriculture, and how does that relate to research infrastructure?
Yeah, I think the word balance is very well chosen here. I do feel that agriculture is a bit of a spread position at the moment. I mean, on the one hand, we have to look at climate mitigation. We have to be able to grow the plants, get the yields with reduced input. And at the same time, and that's something completely different, if you look at it from the plant perspective, you also have to look at climate adaptation, which means we have the same plants with less input, but they have to grow in a completely different environment than what they're currently doing. So we have to move in 2 different directions at the same time. We have the same feeling, I think, on the level of the research infrastructures. From the European perspective, there's the S3 roadmap. For instance, there with emphasis, we're part of the food and health sector, because food is indeed what we need. But of course, if we look at our neighbors from the cluster related to infrastructures, in the environment, there's a strong connection to climate change as well. So also there, we're somewhere in the middle, and in the end, it's all about one health. I think we need healthy soils to produce healthy foods. to be able to sustain healthy people on the planet. And what we need for that is, I think we need to exploit the available genetic resources, not only the main crops, also other crops. And we also will have to embrace, I think, new breeding technologies, because we need to come up with innovations fast and very precise.
Thanks, Dane. I think we've got a question from the audience, and I'll come back. Yes, please, introduce yourself if you don't mind. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you. For those who were not in this room in the previous session, my name is Professor Paul Iji. I'm the Pro-Vice Chancellor of Research at Fiji National University, just across town from my colleague there, Professor Kumar, who is with the regional university. We do work together a lot now. We are collaborators. As I keep reminding them, we are not competitors. Yeah, and both of us host the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research Scholarships there in the Pacific. We cover the whole of the Pacific, so the scholarships are not for Fijian students only. But I like the presentations a lot, especially Professor Kumar touched on some of the challenges of agricultural production. I can speak more on that point because I'm an agricultural scientist. I actually went to Fiji as the Dean of Agriculture before I moved up to central administration. And I was quite interested in Paul's presentations, looking at alternative agriculture, because there is a very strong requirement for that in the South Pacific, as Professor Kumar indicated. Some islands don't have any soil at all, not arable. They just have where they are sitting or sleeping or building. So there is a need to have alternative systems of production. The agro systems or hydro systems and whatever, vertical farming. And I also met my colleague here. I told him I want to have him collaborate with us. We already do with the University of Southern Queensland, because one of the problems with agricultural development in the South Pacific too is that the young people are not too keen. First, they come from a fishing background, but then a country like Fiji is almost entirely reliant on tourism, so they don't have much need. If you do visit Fiji, you are likely going to eat food that is supplied from Australia, not that grown in Fiji. But the land is so fertile, so we need to change those orientations. And for somebody working with precision agriculture and those areas, the young people will find those more attractive. But like I asked in the previous session, we have challenges of infrastructure, especially laboratory infrastructure, agricultural infrastructure, because we want to be able to test these things, develop crop species against salinity that is caused by sea level rise and flooding, etc. So we do welcome that support. Australia is giving a lot of that, I must admit, not only because I'm an Australian citizen, but I do know they receive a lot of support from Australia, New Zealand, EU, etc. But we need equipment to be able to work in situ, on site there, not just scholarship support.
Okay,
So
thank you very much.
so
That's a good comment. I think there's a question. Right, we're overrun with questions all of a sudden. Right. So we'll go to you, Donald, and then we'll go back there. Yep.
Hello, hi. I'm Jo Wingender. I'm from Elixir Europe. We are a digital infrastructure that coordinates life science data in Europe. My question relates a little bit to the first question that was asked by Richard. So it was basically around considering the effects of climate change, and not just in terms of increased floods and droughts, but also if you think about, for instance, the impact on the fertility of land that is already being farmed at the moment. which can also have some negative effects through monoculture, for instance, and those kinds of things. Aside from what Paul mentioned about agriculture in a controlled environment, what other things do you think we should be focusing on right now to make sure that we actually manage to feed the growing population that we will need to sustain in the next few years? And where do you think governments and funders and infrastructure should really focus their attentions most, and also their resources? Thank you.
I think the answer is circularity. We tend, as scientists, to work in silos in our own field, and I think what we are seeing more and more across the world is this circularity aspect. In controlled environment, definitely, that's something we are looking at, but the waste of others, it could be the treasures of others, right? And I think, especially in controlled environment, the big issue that we have is energy, and as soon as we think energy, we think, well, we plug it and we pay a lot of the kilowatt-hour. But energy can come from geothermal, it could come from sun, it could come from wind, it can come from biodigestion, right? And I always cite this amazing project in the UK. So in Lancaster, in UK, you have this farm from Dyson Farming. And Dyson Farming, they don't actually use energy from the grid, they provide energy from the grid. They invested in the infrastructure, they invested into a biodigester, and because Dyson is one of the biggest landowner in the UK doing farming, they take the excess of the land that they have from farming wheat or eventually corn as well, and they bring it to the biodigesters. The biodigester produce energy, and then they power 17 hectares of greenhouse for producing some of the most amazing strawberries that the UK have experienced. And so I think that's really the circularity aspect that we have to do, and I think the way the science is moving is more into a pluridisciplinary aspect. I mean, as European, we kind of know that. Pluridisciplinary, we have been put that in our education 20 years ago and for the past 20 years. But for the rest of the world, sometimes pluridisciplinary aspect is more like how do we do it? And so there is a lot of aspects that way. So I do think that when we think of the growing population and how to feed it sustainably, I think that's the aspect of looking at all the discipline, how we could bring engineers, how we could bring architects, how we can bring city planners into the problems that we are tackling for the future.
Thanks. Yes, Wayne.
I probably wanted to share a project that we are having now. So it's kind of like making a new breeding strategies. So normally we are only considering about breeding the new varieties for the monoculture, right? That's good for the machine harvest. But recently people are considering about the sustainable agriculture. So in other words, it's about the mixing cropping systems now. But we now thought about how to breed the varieties that can coexist with other varieties together at the same time. But this is a complicated system. So you got too much samples you want to analyzing. So on the perspective of the software side, we are started to building the models that can help us to selecting the varieties and predicting the performance of them, so that we can accelerate this breeding processes a little bit quicker than before, so that we can predict what will be the best for the mixing crop systems. Now in Japan, we have this similar project. We just wanted to share it.
Thank you. I'll just keep going with some questions here. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. Jeremy Brownlee from Griffith University, but also the Prime Minister's National Science and Technology Council, and we're looking at research infrastructure and forward planning. So my question's in the framework of, it would appear that research infrastructure in this space is difficult in terms of building flexibility. So Richard, you talked about there's a suite of crops that there's a lot of research done, but there's obviously a lot of other crops that need to be looked at. So how difficult is it to build in flexibility for a range of different crops, but then looking forward, and I guess Danny, to your point about different scales and locations, and how do we address that problem given that there's limited funding and resources?
Great question. Maybe Danny, you've worked in a more variety of crops than all of us. So.
I do think that thinking about what are the major systems that you want to be looking at, as I said, I'm currently working on wheat because it has applicability to both Canada and Australia, where the systems that I've been working in. But we've recently, for example, been working with an industry partner who's interested in cacao and chocolate, and we simply don't have the infrastructure at ANU to be able to work with tall trees. And so I think, again, having a diversity of types of infrastructure that can allow you to address different questions at these different scales is really critical. I think the other thing I'd like to point out is back in May, I was at Michigan State University for a symposium that was about plant resilience. And they brought in researchers from around the globe from 6 continents, so we didn't have Antarctica. And one of the things that really came up was the need for a moonshot, basically, within plant science. And just this idea that, you know, you can get that sort of scale of funding for example, particle physics and these sorts of things, but that in general, when it comes to plant research, even though this is what feeds everybody and produces the oxygen we breathe and maintains the water quality that we use, we don't tend to have that scale of ambition. And so both the idea of investing at that level, but doing it in an international way where we can leverage the skills and the capabilities, but also the different sorts of crop systems and ecosystems that we have, that would be something that would just be really fabulous to see. And it would be nice to see more cooperation between countries that allow for researchers to work at that scale across multiple institutions and multiple facilities.
We'll keep moving on. Donald, do you want to? Right, okay. Yeah, I think, WAY's project, is a great example of how, you can really harness the best people from around the world and, based on these infrastructure. Yeah, go ahead.
So the colleague from Elixir has probably already touched on a lot of this on the sustainability front. But when Paul was presenting, the numbers that scared me most, of many, were that in the context of trying to expand our ability to feed 50%, you were saying that we're already using 70% of our fresh water on agriculture. Oh, was it? Oh, sorry, Richard. Yeah, well done, Richard. Okay, sorry, Richard.
Sorry I scared you.
Yeah, no, it's okay. I'm constantly scared these days. I'm interested in the degree to which vertical farming can indeed sort of help us, and other protected forms of farming. Is this going to allow us to change the fundamental maths of these things to some noticeable degree?
So I think, I preach for the choir here. So I will say yes in terms of water resilience in a certain way. We save about 80-90% of the water that you will get in the field, right? You don't have runoff, so sustainability right away, no pesticide to our river, number one, or fertilizer to our rivers, that's number one. Number two, because you recycle the water. Then the other aspect that we tend to forget is vertical farm also is, or indoor farming, let's call it just indoor farming because it doesn't have to be vertical. You could just be in a room with just one level here. But if you put it indoor, suddenly this facility become a CO2 sucker as well, right? And so you could pump high CO2 into it, grow fast your plants. And so you could decrease, we could think, and we come back to the circularity aspect, you could think of putting a farming or a greenhouse or whatever production of food next to a coal plant, right? A coal power plant. And then the CO2 produced by the coal factory will then be pumped into a greenhouse that will be using for food. So there is all this aspect of possibility of using indoor farming as a way of being more sustainable and using our resources more efficiently in a certain way. But as soon as you get indoor, you need to put light, right? And that have some impact and some money. And of course some energy, and you need to find the energy somewhere. And so there is some aspects that, yes, save on the water. We need to decide what we care more about. Is it more about saving our water or other aspects? And we talk about export here. There is something very interesting about the way we behave. At the moment, there is a lot of energy talk about hydrogen. Right? Hydrogen is a big thing, not to produce energy from hydrogen, but to export our fresh water, to produce hydrogen, to export outside when we don't actually have a lot of fresh water. So there is like these kind of things that are happening. Indoor farming, I do believe, have a way of saving, and it has been demonstrated actually that we can save significant amount of water, nutrient, with the nutrient price also going up. So yes, there is all this aspect, and it doesn't necessarily apply everywhere. And it's just a question to find the right solution for the right place. And I don't think vertical farm is going to replace traditional farming as just one part of the solution. And we need to have all this solution in our toolbox to be able to tackle, as you mentioned, 70% of the water, but we are going to add 2 billion more people on this planet over the next 15 years. we don't have a way to feed them at the moment. So.
You're holding that in a threatening way, Stan, or do you want to make comment?
But actually, he touched on a comment that I wanted to make. Indeed, with the idea, there are a lot of advancements on the level of indoor farming and the possibilities, but it's not going to solve the world. I think it can help in doing local food production where it's very, very challenging. But in the end, I think we need to face that there's millions of hectares outside where we have free water and free sun that is growing our crops, and we cannot think that this will be replaced at the global level by indoor farming. So it's not the holy grail that we're looking at, I'm afraid.
All right, I think we're out of time, yeah? So I think we do have to wrap up. Look, thanks very much. I just recall again that we really talked about the challenge. We talked about the physical infrastructure, and we ended up with some great examples of international collaboration and the way in which this infrastructure can underpin, can encourage that collaboration and can actually be pathways for developing people and linkages internationally. So, we think they're pretty important in terms of answering these big challenges, and I hope you think so as well. So thank you very much for the speakers. I really appreciate the time you put into getting ready for this. Some speakers came from a long distance, made special trips, so thank you very much, particularly Wei. And thank you very much, everyone, and have a good afternoon.